If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. We talk a lot about information. And in the last podcast, we talked a good bit about learning and about ways that we organize information. That is, personal information management as it relates to learning. On this episode, I want to talk about that in more detail with the idea of coming up with actionable approaches to learning. And I'll describe what I mean here. And when we look at information, and I, of course, am fascinated by information theory, that's one of the things I've been studying just about my whole life. But we look at information, what does it mean, and how does it work? And there's a lot of mystery still there, but it's clear that one of the primary uses of information is to help us learn. When we're explicitly learning, we're trying to collect and utilize information. Now, it also works the other way as well. As we're exposed to new information, we have the opportunity to learn. And that's embedded in Claude Shannon's definition of information as roughly being something that reduces surprise. While we know that learning and information storage are related, the exact nature of that relationship is one of those mysteries. Along with many people, I think that learning is more than just storing facts, more than just storing what we think of as information. So today we're going to think a little bit about what learning is. Of course, we all know that learning is important, and I'll draw some fences around the kind of learning I'm talking about doing here. And I'll give us some historical context that's based on the previous podcast, that is episode 68. Now, as I said, we know that information is somehow related to learning. In that vein, we need information in order to learn. And our tendency while we're learning is to gather information. But we have the sense that that's necessary but not sufficient. So the bottom line in this episode, what's a good way to think about the information management that's a part of learning? I'm going to argue that the Commonplace book that we identified from the previous episode is a great target or goal for education that happens to us as adults. Rather than adult education, I'll call that post-compulsory education. When we think about learning, one of the things we mentioned in the previous episode is that learning styles have changed and are changing. And certainly the techniques and the technology have changed to a large degree, but only in some areas. Now, that said, because of my experience in the university classroom, I often say you could drop Sir Isaac Newton in a modern day classroom. And once you get him over the existence of electric lights and the fact that the chalkboard is not chalk, he would do a credible job of lecturing on the calculus. To me, that means there's been technology integrated, but that technology, like many of the technologies in our lives, hasn't fundamentally changed how we go about doing what we do. I've argued that all the technology really hasn't improved much about our work processes. That's episode 40 if you're interested. So learning, at least compulsory education, has changed a little bit, but not very dramatically. So here we need to be thinking about the goal of education. So what's the goal and how do we use the information? Again, I don't want to turn this into some sort of tirade on the current educational system because it does a job and it does that job pretty well. So we'll position this podcast episode as once you get done with compulsory education, how do we go about learning? And also, just to position what we're talking about, I'm specifically talking about academic style subjects. I'm not talking about physical skills. Let's say you want to learn economics as an adult. What would you do? How would we approach that? And what are the practical steps for doing that learning? Now, a lot of people will say, well, you go out there and you read a lot of stuff, and here's a primer to start you off, and then you'll be able to get it up from there. But our scope is a little bit broader than that. It's what do you do with the information in that book, along with all the other information you'll gather? So we'll broaden that a little bit. As we do that, we'll talk about techniques, goals, tactics, and technology for learning. So the first thing we want to do is think through a definition of learning that we can use here, something for us to drive a stake in the ground and consider the technology. We know that learning has to do with information and vice versa. And I'd suggest that learning has a lot to do with creating thought processes, recreating thought processes that another human being thought first. And I think that's a useful definition because it extends learning beyond mere factual knowledge. To refine our definition, it would be learning to think in ways that other people have demonstrated are useful ways to think. So we look at learning, look at the goal of making my brain work the way another brain works, at least for a brief period of time. We think about the great ideas in history that we try to learn and understand and figure out how to apply. Sometimes it's for our own curiosity, and sometimes it's just for the pleasure of acquiring new knowledge and information. So using that definition for learning, make my brain work the way somebody else's brain has worked previously. We'll proceed with understanding the need for information. When we think about doing this, we spend time reading what other people have had to say. If it's a model like math, we try to understand that and apply it in different ways. If it's a syntactical thing, and when I say syntactical, I'm talking about tools that exist in symbols, syntax. I think math is one of these, and certainly programming is. You could even argue that writing in English is a syntactical exercise. What that means is that we have thoughts in our head and we want to make the world conform somehow to that thought, to express that thought in some other system. So this is how we gather information and how we learn is we think about it, we try to apply it. If it's a model, we try to understand it and put it in different contexts. If it's syntactical knowledge, we try it with math, we try with different sets of numbers and see if we can still do it. So if we can agree on that definition for now, how do we go about it? I suggest that we practice thinking like the people that we want to think like later. So if you want to learn calculus, then you go and read about the calculus and you read about Newton or Leibniz, either one. You can even read about the fact that there's a controversy over who was the first publisher of calculus and that these two guys are the candidates. All of this is learning and the ability to make sense of information that we get from the world. So to apply that information somehow in our heads. As we're working through this, we're practicing thinking like that. We go and read Newton's explanation of how he was thinking and what he was thinking about. In formal education, we have exercises in some subjects, like math, and those exercises teach us how to do the procedural pieces. And we practice them over and over again so that we remember them. And thus we learn things like long division. So that's a practice thing. And even if we're learning more abstract conceptual things, we read about how they were considered and thought about in these different approaches to thinking about them. And we do this in order to try to find one that fits into our skull so that we can think about it as well. So yes, learning involves information, but because it has to do with recreating thought processes, it's also got something to do with practice. Now, there's another interesting thread here. When we look at artificial intelligence, which some people say is a learning machine, I would say that one of the great things about AI, at least in my mind, previous models of AI, I don't have that firm a grasp on what Chat GPT actually is or does. But the previous models, you go things like Deep Blue that won the World Chess Championship a decade ago, and the computer that bested the Go champion, those kinds of computers. That kind of artificial intelligence, it practices. Once did an analysis of the Go situation, the human against the computer, and the computer anecdotally had played, quote, millions of games, quote. The best human player had at most played thousands or maybe 10,000 or so. Now, if those two statements are true, that's 4 orders of magnitude difference in the number of practices that each of the opponents had engaged in. And that's a huge difference. For every game that the human had practiced, the machine had practiced, let's say, 1,000 games. It's a massive difference. So when I think about that kind of AI, I think it's this great practice machine. What's interesting is that's another thread that helps us associate learning with practice in our heads. Another part of learning is collecting the information that we need so that we can practice having our brains think in these ways. I'm a student of the Bible. And if you're studying ways to think about that, for example, there are plenty of commentaries. And they answer the question, how did other people think about this? I'm not reading those so that necessarily I can adopt their specific thoughts about it, but so I can see the way other human brains have assessed this material and use it to craft my own approach and build it up from existing building blocks. In my opinion, we talk about learning, there are plenty of really smart people. And if we would just learn what they thought and how to think in those same ways, then we're probably better off as individuals and as cultures. We're probably smarter than before. It seems to me that a lot of current education has to do with rebuilding thought structures from the ground up, going back to first principles or whatever. I think that's wasteful and error prone. I'm sure somebody somewhere has said that when you learn something from scratch, your responsibility, your task is to recreate all the errors of all the previous people who finally helped to get us where we knew this information or something like that. But we do wind up making those same mistakes. And so I say, use authority figures where it makes sense to do that. If we're going to learn, we've got to practice. So we've got to have information that helps us practice. And certainly if practice is involved, then there are tasks that we have to do, and thus we need to manage our attention around learning. This is not a new idea. We all know if you're going to learn something, you've got to pay attention to the information that supports learning, that supports this act of making your brain work in certain ways. Learning information, practicing tasks, all these things fit very well into what we're trying to do in the bigger picture with attention compass. Certainly productivity and these kinds of ideas. And one of the keys to productivity is learning new things and learning more effective or more efficient ways to do things. Learning, as we've said, is this collection of information, management of information, and the organization of our information and attention so that we actually do the practice. So one of the big questions that we'll talk about here is how do we organize our information such that we can find it when we need it? For example, I know people who have done very credible jobs of explaining concepts that I want to know about better, but I've forgotten what they said or where they said it or what book it was. So how can I record and organize that information and review it so that I'm practicing making my brain think in these more useful ways? Now, as I mentioned, one additional thing that we know is that learning takes attention. So there's time involved. We know information is involved, both as an input and presumably as an output. And we know we've got to manage that information such that we can actually do the practices required, the practice sessions required to learn to think in certain things. And this ties us back to the previous podcast. For the past, say, 2 centuries, there's been this very tight connection between the act of learning and books. Perhaps it's been forever that these two things have been tightly associated. Now, I'm not saying that the only way to learn is to read books, although I think that's probably one of the best ways at present. Again, I mean academic style learning, not practical learning like how to swing a golf club. If you want to learn how to swing a golf club, the best way is probably to get somebody to show you how to do it. And then you go do it and have somebody watch you and they tell you what you're doing wrong so that you can build good physical habits. In academic style learning, we're bringing in books as we talk about that. And I'll say that books are, at a minimum, a required feature of pedagogy. Pedagogy, of course, being the tools and techniques of helping someone to learn. In other words, it's been 200 plus years. If there was something better at our disposal than books, physical or otherwise, we would have found it by now and utilized it, is my opinion. So books are a big piece of that. Now, there is, of course, debate over whether the standard pedagogy that we use is the best possible. There are plenty of people that are critiquing how the formal education and compulsory education systems are working, particularly in the West, as far as I know. But that's not our issue here. We're studying at a broader level. But we do know that books are heavily involved in what's going on. So let's keep that in mind. And it's really important that we deal with books as part of our information. That's why I want to look at post-compulsory education. And as adults, then we can consider what pedagogy makes sense to us. I would guess that we'd be better off using a similar pedagogy to the one that's used in our compulsory educational systems. And again, we utilize books. I suggest that we adopt the book metaphor, and that's just the way we store this kind of information as a culture. Now, education, compulsory education in the 21st century is not just any old book, it's largely textbooks. And that's why I said in the last 200 years, because we began to use textbooks towards the early to mid 1800s. Now, for good or ill, rightly or wrongly, the modern formal education pedagogy is all about textbooks. I think there's probably some solid reasons for that, but that doesn't matter. It is what it is. Again, very close ties to books. My concern is that in the adult learning space, capital T textbooks are not as readily available. And oh, by the way, textbooks are really, really hard to read on your own. So I'm thinking, well, there was a time before textbooks. How did education work then? And I'd suggest that it still involves books. They just weren't textbooks. So we've got this situation where textbooks are going to be hard to find. So what did humans do before textbooks existed? How do we go about using books and information in learning? In the previous podcast, we talked about the notion of the commonplace book and how that was a great way to store certain kinds of information. And we even arrived at the conclusion that a commonplace book could be a good goal for learning exercises. And that brings us to when we think about the tactics of learning after compulsory education, how do we make the best use of our efforts? What do we do to make our learning as efficient as possible? That said, this is not a I'll help you learn anything in 10 days episode. It's not. I'm just thinking about the fact that as adults, one of the primary reasons we collect information is related to learning. So, what can we take away from that as an adult learner? Again, I think the creation of your own commonplace book is a pretty good way to do that. One of the challenges of post-compulsory education is getting somebody to tell you how you're doing. When do you know enough to say you can move on? Now, whether you agree that compulsory education handles that well or poorly, we have to agree that it certainly does it. You're done with Algebra 1, move on. And maybe this notion of a commonplace book would be a good approach because it's a discrete set of information that we can evaluate as an objective measurement. Now, I think, as we said in the last podcast episode, prior to textbooks, the commonplace book was the goal of learning in lots of subjects. Now, a commonplace book would be maybe not your own textbook for learning. I don't think we'd try and create a textbook here. I'll have more to say about this. But certainly it would be your breadcrumbs for not forgetting. It would be an asset of what information did you get together in order to learn the subject in question. Now, I think textbook authors probably have in mind that you could learn their subject from simply operating their textbook well. They might even say you don't need a teacher. That's a reasonable approach, particularly for post-compulsory education, because teachers are harder to find. I love teachers, but teachers are primarily coaches, motivators, obstacle removers, not primarily information disseminators. Now, I think that's a great place to be and a great thing for us to have is their expertise there, because a lot of us need that coaching. But I think a commonplace book that I would write on a subject that I had learned would be very different from a textbook. But what does it look like if it doesn't look like a textbook? So we're going to drill down on this. A commonplace book that I would write on a subject that I had learned would be very different from a textbook. So if I'm not trying to write a textbook, what does this book I'm trying to create actually look like? We're going to drill down on this, and our question might be, what would it look like for me as an adult to develop a commonplace book on a specific subject in my world? So we'll explore this example at some point. As an example, this podcast is sort of a commonplace book for me. I'm trying to learn things about personal information management and then bring them back and express them to you in meaningful ways. And the podcast as an asset presents an opportunity for me to go back and listen to the thoughts that I was having as I was trying to explain this to you, as I'm wrestling with these thoughts myself. So it helps me recall the ways that I tried to explain it to myself, should I forget it or need a refresher or whatever. I certainly need more practice in thinking thoughts these ways, and the podcast helps me do that. So let's, for now, accept that the goal of an adult education exercise would be to create a commonplace book. Now, we know it's not going to look like a textbook, and we know it might look more like the podcast. Let's figure out what its purpose is. At a minimum, I think if I was developing a commonplace book for a subject, I don't think it would have pages and pages of exercises. although some examples would probably be useful, perhaps some edge techniques that are rarely used. Maybe have some recorded processes for those. In an area like cooking, you'd record the recipe for a special, unusual, infrequent kind of pastry. You probably wouldn't record the recipe for biscuits because you can do that in your sleep. But the pâte à choux recipe is probably written down. Now, I would expect that the book would have cases and examples, maybe war stories. Here's how I tried to apply this information in this situation. Here's a thing that seemed to make sense for me to try, but it worked out poorly in these ways. So you're collecting up this information and these stories and anecdotes that help you practice thinking in the ways that you want to think in the future. Now, we said a commonplace book is not a textbook, but it's probably somewhere on the spectrum between an authored nonfiction book on one end and a scrapbook on the other. And I say that to say there's this big foraging kind of piece here, scrapbooking, gathering these scraps and snippets of information. Just to get a mental picture here, if you recall the first Indiana Jones movie, he was looking for the Ark of the Covenant, the biblical Ark. And he had this notebook that he's carrying around, and he kept looking in it for information about the locations of things, lore and legend about what might have happened to things. That was sort of a commonplace book. The collection of bits and snippets, sometimes fully formed thoughts, papers that might be important that help us explain something, all these different kinds of information. So if we're making a commonplace book, it's not going to be like sitting down and authoring a nonfiction book. It's more of a collection, an ongoing collection of notes on an experiential pursuit of something. Now, the other big piece here is going to be organizing this information so that you can find it, because it's unlikely that you'll want to reread your book again from cover to cover. I'm not an author, but I don't know that I would love rereading my own writing in any event. Even if that were something to do, it wouldn't be particularly efficient. So, in addition, this book will need to have table of contents, indexing. You're probably going to return to this book for a specific purpose. So, leave yourself some breadcrumbs for finding what you need and doing that quickly. So we've got some ideas of what the book might look like. It would have examples, anecdotes, some practices, some recipes. It would have some syntactical approaches to some edge cases. Probably have more than a little bit of motivation in it. Why did I do this to begin with? And it would certainly be heavily indexed, thorough table of contents so that we can use it as a reference book. And that's what it is, a reference book for later application of the knowledge that it's about. So as we think about creating that, so now we've got an idea of what we're creating. So what would be a tactic? What would be the tactics I should engage in for creating this? Associated question is, what technologies would I use to help me do this? Now, I will say if the creation of the commonplace book is a whole separate project, then there's a real risk that it'd never get done because it's never going to be urgent. It probably needs to be something that's built into the learning process itself. In addition, organizing information is one of the better ways to learn that information. So that recording could be part of the learning process. So in our world, how can we collect information in such a way that our use of an artifact puts that information in the position of being part of a record for what we're going to do? How do we collect this information? As an example, if you're learning some system and you develop a spreadsheet to do a specific kind of calculation, where are you going to put that spreadsheet? Because it's part of your learning. Also, how would we manage information about the spreadsheet? Oh, it only works in these cases. And I learned that by recognizing that it didn't work in that case. As adults, we do our learning projects typically as part of our lives. It fits into everything else we're doing. Now, sometimes we're engaged in learning projects, other times we're not. Sometimes we might be having two that overlap. But ideally, we would have something in our workflow that supports our information management in ways that would also support this goal of creating something like a commonplace book as we're learning. Now, I suggest it's a secondary issue as we're creating this commonplace book, whether we actually bring all the information together in a bound journal. That really doesn't have a ton of influence over how we do it. Particularly if the information is well organized through other means. Now, on the other hand, as I said, I'm a student of the Bible. I've led discussion groups at the individual church level and still do. It's not formal level theology or formal learning. But because of that, I've got an extensive set of thoughts and commentaries and notes that I use to guide discussion in these different areas, different parts of the Bible. And from time to time, I wonder if that would be something that might be useful for future folks who care what I thought about the Bible. I certainly don't think it would be a published book, but if there was some way to transmit that data further down, would it make sense for me to print it out and get it bound? In the personal information management work I do, I teach the notion of a project location, a project folder, or a project book. Now, this is a place where information about a project goes. It's kind of a catch-all category, and certainly there are other categories that apply to most of the information that lands there. But the notion of this project folder where all the stuff about the project goes or lives, at least metaphorically speaking. And that's an interesting concept because so much of what we learn is through having to find and apply information the first time. And that's what happens in projects all the time. We say, for example, I've got to do a new marketing proposal. And we think, well, it's a project, so I'm going to gather up information about how to do it. I'm going to gather up that in the current situation, and I'm going to produce a written document of some sort as the result of the project. So that gathering of information, of learning techniques, of examples, all that is captured. Maybe we thought that the internet usage statistics would be useful to help us, develop this marketing. Well, it turned out that the ones we could get weren't as useful as another source. So in the future, we sure would like to go to the second source and not the first one. So this kind of information would be in the project folder more or less naturally. Now, projects are interesting critters because they're usually one-off things that it's something that's not routine in our lives, and that's why we call it a project. They usually have a pretty definite calendar date and a definitive kind of structured approach to get them done. And part of that means it's going to produce some artifacts. When we're looking at a project, at a minimum, there are multiple steps. That's what makes it a project. We need to keep track of things between the multiple tasks in order to make the larger project a reality out of it. And so through that process, we produce these rich artifacts of how it's going to get done. Now, this is this project file that I mentioned before, the storage location. All the different components of learning of information for that project collect up in one location. And we're storing it because it's important in the short term. So while we're doing that, we might as well store it as if it were important for long term also, assuming we can do so efficiently. We've learned to do a parsimonious storage thing, and I'm going to suggest that that makes little sense in the information age. Currently, our only problem with having a huge amount of information is that the bigger the pile, the more things get lost and the more often things get lost. But if you have a top-notch organizational scheme, then your pile can get as big as it needs to get, and you still won't lose things. In that scenario, there's no downside of continuing to collect information. Since it doesn't have a physical reality, it's not pushing you out of your house. So I don't think the hoarding rules apply. Now, as a matter of course, in our normal operation, we're storing it again because it's important in the short term. We might need to respond to it, but then just also adding in a way to keep it in the long term. And that might be important long-term information because in many cases, a project will require you to bone up on some technique or technology that maybe you're familiar with but haven't used in a long time, or maybe you need to get new skills. So it'd be interesting and useful to keep those notes in the project file as well. Now, in the long term, they wouldn't necessarily just associate with the project itself as much as they would associate with the skill or tactic that you learned while doing the project. We're storing information for one set of reasons, but it sure would be nice if we could also refer to it for other sets of reasons. And so we want to think about that as we create or evaluate this organizational scheme. Now, certainly there are things that are going to be in the project archive that are not useful for the long term. Internal communications, coordination of meetings, attendance logs, probably not useful in the long term. So there's some subset that is going to be useful. And so it does need some reorganization. Not only is this subset fragmented into being about other things, but it's also not the whole project file that we need to refer to. If we just leave it in the project file, then we probably will really struggle to find it again. Which project was it on that I learned how to build the spreadsheet that does the thing? So again, an argument for having additional features of the storage beyond just a project file. Now, I mentioned before that creating this commonplace book can't be a project on its own because then it'll never get done. I mean, just think about it. If I said to you, hey, at the end of each project you do, you need to go through and sort through all the information in the project folder you created and decide where to put it in commonplace books. You'd look at me like I'm crazy. You don't have time to do that. It's too much of a lift and it's never going to be urgent. So ideally, we would organize this information on the fly, and that would be efficient. Both store it for the short term and store it for the long term. In this sense, the commonplace book would be a recipient of information that you pulled out of the project file. And it's going to be about, okay, I learned this thing, or I learned something about this thing during this project. Now, while there's a wealth of learning, if you had to learn everything for a project from scratch, then you probably wouldn't be assigned the project to begin with. So again, it's this subset of information from the project file that we need to record in our one or more commonplace books. And certainly that's what I'm arguing. The project folder is one collection or one index. The commonplace book, where I record information about a learning that I had or a subject that's utilized within the project, is a different collection. So then, if we're going to do this daily and we're going to have two different collections for the same information, how do we do that? Because we can't carry all the books around with us at once. Now, when we looked in the previous episode at commonplace books, we sort of thought about having a journal. And a journal is this sequential daily set of notes and things that I did. It might contain artifacts you created, maybe not. And then mostly it's going to be about some daily process or procedure where you distill out things that would be useful for various kinds of learnings. The day-to-day journal really can't be the commonplace book because they're going to be organized very, very differently. I mean, the last thing you want is to have to wander through your diary to find breadcrumbs about something that you learned in a project that lasted for a year that ended a decade ago. You want to distill it down and make it clearer than that. So that's, again, argument for another organizational scheme. Certainly one way to think about it would be, well, let me take the journaling approach, which is how this information is going to collect up the day-to-day. And then let me pull out things that I think are important. Now, this is always an estimate. There's no bright line, but let me identify them for this longer term storage. Now, if you're dealing with paper, there's different technologies, ways to do this. For example, it's conceivable that you could carry around a 3-ring binder with blank sheets. And at the end of the day, you take the no longer blank sheets and pull them out and stick them in other 3-ring binders. And there's different technologies, but the key is that we've got to be able to reorganize information. Now, as part of our thought exercise, let's move away from the image of writing in a journal. Let's move away from writing on paper. If there was a way for information to simultaneously live in 2 different indexes, to roughly have 2 different locations at the same time, that'd be a major step forward. As an example, if you got a quote from a vendor for a specific project, you put that in the project folder index so that when you're thinking about the project, you can find the quote. Maybe at the same time, you could index it in another index so that it's about vendor X, who I've used before and I have a history with. So you could have the simultaneous creation of multiple indexes. And then that'd be really cool because you could have a short term and a long term. Now, oh, wow, I'm going to have, 1 billion concurrent indexes. I don't think it would be that large. I think it'd be on the order of 3 to 5 concurrent indexes for any piece of information. Certainly, it wouldn't be 10 or more. Certainly, each commonplace book would be its own index. So that's indexed according to subject we learned. So this notion of multiple indexes pointing at the same piece of information. It'd be a very convenient way to do this kind of thinking. Those of you that are familiar with the podcast will recognize that what I just described for you is a practical application of one of the core features of the attention compass. I've described it in various ways in various episodes. One way I've described it is to make pieces of information look as if they were in more than one location at the same time, and how this organizational scheme is the best that we can do with our present technology. In fact, I'll argue it's theoretically the best. And I say that as an information scientist. It's because our information is not discrete pieces. It's not sentences that I need to store. It's much less structured than that. So this online archive with a good structure will give us significant advantages in the face of that challenge. So if we have this multiple index system from Attention Compass, that would satisfy the need that we have for multiple indexes. So yes, a sequential organizational scheme is fun, but you can also organize it by project. You can organize it by subject. You can have multiple indices pointing into the one piece of information. Again, I'll use the example. Back in the day, libraries had multiple physical card catalogs, had 3. And each one was organized in a different way. But the pointers on the cards all went back to the Library of Congress number that identified nothing but the storage location for the book in question. So if we can do that same multiple indexing, then we can have the capability to build a draft of the commonplace book on the fly. Then, depending on how good our draft was and the time available, maybe we don't need to go through an additional step of compiling the book. bringing it all into one physical location, because we've already done that, at least metaphorically. It's in the same area of storage. So that's my argument. So let me back up. It's been a lot. Let me back up and recap and see what we've gotten together here. As an adult learner, the pedagogical tools of compulsory education are not as readily available to us. Books are still heavily important, though, because books are the primary ways that we organize, transport, and deliver complex information. Now, that leads us to this notion of a commonplace book as we defined it in the previous episode. It's my own book of knowledge that I can refer to if I need to supplement my own mental knowledge state. We said at the outset that learning was thinking like other people thought, only more quickly. Because we don't have to figure it out. They've told us what to think. So when we're learning, there's that information piece, capturing that information such that we can continue to practice thinking in these new ways and continue to practice using these tools so that we get good results and we're able to move our projects along. Well, the challenge is nobody's got time to sit down and write that book. And two is it's made up sort of a scrapbooking mentality, which is what we thought about. So how do we collect up these pieces in real time during our normal workflows? That's our challenge. How do we gather these scraps into a meaningful collection? So we took a quick look at project folders as an example of how information might be stored for one purpose. Then we looked at layering another indexing scheme on top of that. Think about a project folder. Okay, well, that artifact goes in commonplace book A, while the thing right next to it in the project folder goes in commonplace book B. And so that indicates to us that we need this multiple indexes system. And then it just becomes a question of how do we construct those? Certainly, we have the right kinds of computerized tooling. It's pretty straightforward. I say that because multiple indexing is the very nature of how Attention Compass works and how it helps us with our productivity. So if you've implemented your own Attention Compass, then the takeaway from this podcast is very simple, which is to create and use one or more indexes or tags that have to do with one or more commonplace books. That'd be a very efficient way to do that. And then in future, you can just have that index and go back and refer to it if you need refreshers on this learning that took place at some point in your day-to-day work. So having an attention compass makes the notion of multiple commonplace books almost free. That's a very valuable notion. So as you're learning and you're going through your routine, you can actually begin to create these useful artifacts, these commonplace books. It may be valuable to others, but it will certainly be valuable to you in future. And this just turned into another example of the usefulness of the multiple indexing scheme that is really the foundation of Attention Compass. Now, thinking back about creating this commonplace book as a goal of adult education, I think it's amazingly useful for us to think in those ways as we learn a new subject. And so in this present episode, we're following up on that previous podcast where we talked about commonplace books as a thing. So I'll refer you to that episode. You're probably interested. I'll link to it in the show notes. Just to let you know, I'm happy to have a conversation about where you are with your attention and task management system. Can your attention and task management system help you create commonplace books? Does it make it easy for you to do that? I'm happy to have a conversation about where you are with your attention and task management system. And one of the questions we can consider is, does your current system allow you to easily implement the notion of commonplace books in your information store? If it doesn't, then I'd suggest that perhaps Attention Compass would be a good scheme, a good workflow for you to adopt, so that then you can have this richer information storage and better utilize information for your own learning. If you'd like to do that, reach out and book an hour, and we'll find out if we need to work together. I'll put a link to my scheduler in the show notes. If you do that, in the notes field, please mention that you heard the podcast and what you'd like to talk about as precisely as you can. I'll look forward to hearing from you. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.